Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in for this pre-concert discussion with Ruben Valenzuela, the director of Bach Collegium San Diego. My name is Roseen Giles. I'm a musicologist with a specialty in early modern Italian music, and I'm assistant professor of music at Duke University, as well as the curator of Duke University's musical instrument collections. As I mentioned, I'm joined in this pre-concert discussion by Ruben Valenzuela, who is the founder and artistic director of the Bach Collegium San Diego. As a conductor, keyboardist, and musicologist, he has led the Bach Collegium San Diego in numerous notable performances of music of the Renaissance, the Baroque, through to the early classical period. Under Valenzuela's leadership, Bach Collegium San Diego has achieved local, national, and international acclaim through highly charged virtuosic performances of iconic repertoire and also lesser-known works, some of which you'll hear in the concert to follow. In addition to being an organist, director, and accompanist, he is also a musicologist and has undertaken research on fascinating but sometimes neglected repertoires, including 17th and 18th century music in Mexico City, and a subject actually quite close to my heart, the music of the Anglo-Canadian composer Healy Willan. Very fascinating stuff. But today we'll be hearing music by and for women composers of the 17th century, which is yet another repertoire not very often heard in performance. So, my first question for you is about the name of today's concert. How did you come to call the concert Muses of Parnassus, and how does this theme unite the pieces on the program?
Well, as we came to having to come up with a virtual concert at this time, and it was quite literally in the very still opening of the pandemic, I think a lot of us had questions. And I thought, well, what kind of programming can we do? And I thought, you know what would be interesting is to put together a program of women composers. And I started looking at iconography of the Italian iconography of the 17th century and even just before. And of course, one bit of iconography that's ubiquitous is this depiction of the Muses of Parnassus, where you have depictions of female musicians playing various instruments. And this is quite extraordinary because if you go back into iconography, even before that and so forth into history, that really is hard to find. But the iconography is absolutely filled with this depiction of the nine muses. And more importantly, women depicted favorably as proponents of music, which is, of course, not the case in other iconography. And so that was sort of the thing that just sort of kickstarted. You know what? I think we could go with this title. Obviously, each of these composers, at some point, I think it was even Leonarda who was called the Muse of Navarra. And so I thought, okay, this is I think perfect. We'll go with Muses of Parnassus, and of course, some of the texts that were, especially the Strozzi texts, lent themselves very clearly to this title. So that's how I arrived at it.
Yeah, wonderful. And I mean, the idea of women as musicians in terms of mythology as muses, you know, they're almost sort of symbols for these art forms. But of course, women were quite literally musicians and composers in Renaissance and Baroque, not just as symbols, but in practice. So I guess my next kind of theme is that about the women that are on the program that we're about to hear. Some of them were known as performers primarily, and then others were also composers. And those two roles are they're related, of course, but I'm curious about how you see them both as performers and as composers, especially since every single one of them has had kind of an extraordinary life. So how did the particular stories of each of these composers on the program affect, do you think, the music that they wrote and performed?
Yeah, I think there are two strands here that come to the fore in this era, and that one is the rise of the virtuosic female voice. Finally, you know, we have the opulence of the Italian courts, and not just Italian courts, but other courts, where suddenly this the female voice as a virtuosic instrument is a commodity. So you have that on one hand. Then on the other hand, you have the rise of printed music kind of running at the same time. And in the case of Leonarda, which those extraordinary sonatas, we also have the rise of the violin as an important instrument in Italian music. And of course, from there it goes into other areas. And I think, with both Strozzi, well, all three of them, they're sort of born into a context that allows them this opportunity to showcase their talents from a very early age. I think it was with, of course, Francesca Caccini, with her father being Giulio Caccini, Leonarda in the convent, although she's within those walls of the convent, she has a very formalized musical structure there from which she can sort of catapult her works, and of course quite prolific. And of course Strozzi, who has that sort of also interesting combination of not only being an incredible virtuosic singer, but also that very complicated situation where women were still seen as, oh, she's in the public as a performer. And this idea of her sexuality even comes into the fore here as a courtesan, and what it means to be a female musician performer in public becomes an interesting situation there that I think is part of the story, at least with Strozzi for sure. So yeah.
I would say probably with all three of them, there's something extraordinary about the lives of each of those women, either coming from the context of a convent, or being the daughter of a really famous musician in the case of Caccini, or being the illegitimate daughter of a very famous poet, which is the case for Barbara Strozzi. So in many ways, the fact that there's that extraordinary factor in each one of these women's lives allowed them, as you're saying, to be in the public as musicians, whereas if they didn't have that, they might not have been able to do these things. So it's one of these ways that women musicians and performers kind of found alternative channels for being professional musicians.
Right. And I think, let me add also that another catalyst, I think, is obviously the rise of the monody. The solo song is a very important part of all of this, that creates sort of this avenue for these three composers to flourish. Obviously, court life and the importance of court life and court musicians takes on an important role here, whereas obviously the church structure would have not allowed for this, had these three composers been born 100 years before, I think would have been looking at, we would never know who they were probably. But yeah. I think having these virtuosic singers in court life was, like I said, a commodity. By the way, I have this kind of singer that is really sought after, singing this music that is now really sought after in my court. Like, have a look over here. So,
although interestingly, also the religious context, although they wouldn't allow for, let's say, the performance of that kind of operatic music, they did nevertheless provide a milieu for women composers to write sacred music, for instance, or the academies, which kind of engendered the genre of the cantata, that is obviously so important for Barbara Strozzi's music, which is kind of, this fascinating history of contexts of performance, which is wonderful. I think the program really brings those together, all these different spaces that women had a chance to have their music performed. So I want to ask you about one of the really big challenges about performing early music. It's a challenge, but it's also kind of an opportunity for creativity. And that is that when you play early music, a lot of the times, not all of the practical information that you need in order to perform the pieces might be written down on the score. So this is particularly true. It's true for the vocal music, but it's also particularly true for the instrumental pieces, especially in terms of how much of the music that we're going to hear is unwritten. And so I want to ask you, but how do you use these kinds of gaps in the notation to craft a new interpretation of early music?
That is a great question. And I think it's literally the information you don't have that makes, it's what attracted me to early music in the first place. Specialists in early music, you see certain figures, gestures that lead you down certain paths. And I think that's very much true with any of this repertory. obviously the late, the earlier you go, 17, there's even less and less information, but a single bass line, the motion of a bass line, a motion of a bass line against another line leading to a dissonance can just propel you into thinking of certain figures that one needs to bring to the table or not bring to the table. I mean, it really comes down to that. And this music is just rich in that way. If folks who will see this video can just compare it to, say, the music of the late Baroque or the high Baroque, and of course the Handel, well, Handel's different, but you look at somebody like Bach, you look at, I mean, Bach, he literally, you could almost say he writes everything in. He leaves very little to chance. He writes ornamentation out. He writes, it's just layered in information. And you compare that to the music of the front end of the Baroque. And yeah, you just have to be quite facile and familiar with the gestures, or I guess the fancy words is the figure that the composer is throwing at you, and make music out of those little nutshells of information.
Yeah, there's definitely lots of room for improvisation and this syntax that we can connect emotionally with now in the 21st century, but there's so much there's so many practices that were clearly so ubiquitous that they didn't even need to write them down. But we need to engage in this creative process of reconstruction, which is really an opportunity to be expressed.
Right. And when you look at, I hope I got this right, I think it's the Lagrime, I think it ends with the famous tetrachord, the lamento bass. So that, that's like sort of low hanging fruit for, Baroque composers of, we're going to go that direction and weep and wail and moan. Well, here we go. Here's that. And knowing what leads to it, what comes out of it, I think informs some of the music making decisions that surround an arresting moment, like a lament bass, and that sort of thing. So yeah, so it's knowledge of the gestures and the language and the syntax, as you said.
Exactly, yeah. So let's stay with Lagrime Mie of Barbara Strozzi for just 1 second. I think that's the first thing on the program, is it not?
It is, yes.
So that's the first thing we're going to hear. So many poems from the 17th century that were set to music, or poems in general, but especially the ones that were set to music, play with gender roles in really fascinating ways. So for instance, the Strozzi texts on the program, they're all written to women as the beloved, that's to whom the poems are addressed. So very often there are these kinds of paradoxes in early Baroque poetry, but I want to ask you about how this plays out in terms of voice and perspective. In that piece, who do you think is supposed to be speaking in the music? Is the singer supposed to be acting as a particular character, or are they narrating a story? So how do you think that plays out even in the two Strozzi selections on the program?
Yeah, that definitely became a point of discussion. So Jennifer Ellis Kampani, the wonderful soprano who's on this recording, who did this project with us, asked that very question, and we came to the conclusion that we felt that it was very much a narrative from a neutral person who was narrating this scena, like that, as it was going in both pieces, as a matter of fact, and felt that again, comparing it to, say, particular roles, because I was just in the midst of a St. John Passion, a Bach, how those characters in that setting are leaning towards more the actual personalities, the characters that are being sung about, or from the perspective from which the music is coming from. So yeah, in our approach in this music, we felt, you know what, let's keep it neutral. We're just telling a story from a distance, and let the drama unfold in that manner, rather than trying to embody a particular character as it went.
Yeah, and I think that the poetry, or at least these kinds of chamber pieces, that's what they're really good at doing. It's on some level, you can't help but imagine that this person who's standing in front of you singing is telling you their own feelings.
Right.
But there's something about the text, and I think the audience will see that in the subtitles, that suggests that that it's not just one person, that you're actually kind of seeing these emotions and these situations from the perspective of multiple people.
Right.
you know, and it's a really interesting kind of interplay of different kind of perspectives that madrigals and cantatas, these chamber pieces, are just perfect at doing.
Yes.
So it's kind of a magical moment in the history of Italian secular music.
Absolutely.
I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I have one final question for you, and this is kind of a little bit of philosophy to leave our audience members into the concert. So although often in so many aspects of our lives, we tend to prize things like consistency, logical repetition, something that makes sense and has a structure in that sense. The 17th century, by contrast, seems to prize an aesthetic of variety, asymmetry, contrasts, everything that doesn't quite fit together. And you get the sense that you're just supposed to be delighted in the unexpected. So how should listeners think about this particular aspect as they listen to the program?
Yeah, therein lies the absolute most glorious thing about this era. 17th century Baroque music is that it is just, that is at its very core. The intent there is to create as grotesque of asymmetries as things that aren't seemingly alike. Like there, you know, even if you look at counterpoint, the idea of counterpoint, of one line against the other, where you seemingly have two things that are asymmetric, you know, they're going apart, but it leads you to an ugly dissonance. I think that is the role of not only the music, but the performer, to bring out those contrasts in the most dramatic way possible. And this pervades music, you know, this era of music clear through. I mean, Bach was late in doing this. He was still doing this, you know, and well into the middle of the 18th century. But of course, the 17th century is when it's at its very, I mean, it is boiling hot, these ideas. And so as you listen to this program, one of the reasons that we started the program with the dramatic Lagrime is because in the first 10 seconds, I think you will understand how these ideas and these gestures that I referred to earlier play out. This idea of a line that's static, that's not moving, versus a line that's just weeping and lamenting, coming down, sort of like breaking apart, eventually leading you to some cadence. I mean, this is like, in a nutshell, like what this music is. In 10 seconds, I think it encapsulates that. And it just goes from there. The sonata, the solo violin sonata, the opening of that sonata is absolutely extraordinary. The Leonarda, that it essentially does what the Lagrime does at the beginning, but this time with the solo violin doing it, where the continuo just is holding essentially a pedal, and the violin is just leaning into one dissonance after another before arriving at a resolution. And again, this discomfort of being tousled around, it's like a roller coaster of emotion, which is what attracts me to this repertoire for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sort of last thing that you suggested is absolutely right, which is, yes, texted music has words that can convey emotions, but actually the instrumental music does it too. So it's actually something really, really fundamental, and that pleasure in the discomfort of it. I mean, it's kind of a very fundamental and powerful message on what it means to be human.
Absolutely. And in that program, as we put it together, I think the one piece that I sort of knew quite well of the Lagrime, of course, all of us, if you've ever gone through the whole cycle of music history as an undergrad, you probably will hear that piece or come across that piece somewhere along the line, perhaps. But the other pieces were somewhat relatively unknown to me. And I walked away thinking these Leonarda sonatas that's just some of the most incredible string writing of its period of the 17th century. I mean, it's just, you can see a continuum clear through Corelli and the rise of the violin, and of course using, like you said, untexted music in a very dramatic way is quite extraordinary.
Exactly. No, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Ruben, for this
wonderful,
wonderful and very enlightening discussion. I think it really sort of sets the stage, as it were, for the performance, which we come to now. So the Bloomington Early Music Festival is proud to present for you Bach Collegium San Diego with soprano Jennifer Ellis Kampani and director Ruben Valenzuela in their concert program, Muses of Parnassus. So please enjoy.